Well, after that sobering, I think is probably the right word, sobering analysis by Mohammed, we're going to now have a panel to discuss whether we really should be quite as depressed as I am after listening to him. We're going to discuss the global economic outlook. Unfortunately, the outlook, short-term outlook, is not great. The world economy is growing at its slowest pace since the Great Recession. And if you look around the US, Europe, China, you see enormous amounts of political uncertainty, leadership transitions, huge political uncertainty. And I asked the members of our panel separately, so they couldn't crib off each other, which part of the world they were most worried about, and we got the same answer, which was Europe. So I think we're going to start with Europe. But to discuss where the world economy is going, we have two terrific panelists, Dave McCormick, co-president and member of the management committee of Bridgewater Associates. Dave, thank you very much for joining us. And Steve Pagliuca, managing director of Bain Capital. Steve, come and join us too. And at some point, we will be joined by Roger Altman of Evercore, but Roger has been detained, unfortunately. I'm not quite sure whether it's by New York traffic or in a client meeting, but he's hoping to join us a bit later. But for the moment, you both separately set the agenda by saying that Europe worried you most. So I think we should start there, but I'd like to do a kind of, in the time we've got, a little tour d'horizon of the world and see whether we all are as depressed as Mohammed makes me feel after his excellent remarks. And I'm going to try and provoke you, since you worry a lot about Europe, by saying that I'm actually less worried about Europe than I was a few months ago. And I find myself sometimes being the most optimistic person around. And the reason is that I think there has been a pretty big game change in the past couple of months. The ECB's decision to be effectively a conditional lender of last resort, I think was a pretty big deal. And there's a long way to go, but do you agree, or do you think that they've just done more to buy time and it's the same dynamic repeating itself? And David, let's start with you. Why are you most worried about Europe?
Well, I think there's reasons to be optimistic based on what you said. So in other words, I think the difference from early in the year to now is material in terms of the policy response. But
you're not going to get the optimism for long.
I'll give that a minute. But I think there's...
It's going really bad in Europe.
Thanks for the exit.
But there, as you said, there's a long, long way to go. And I think it's important to put the current situation in Europe within the much broader context of the long-term debt cycle. What we're seeing is an event that happens every 50 or 75 years, and this deleveraging that Europe is facing, the US is facing, is the biggest in history. And so the enormity of the debt problem in terms of the bank balance sheets and the sovereign debt risk is going to require an enormous policy response that's going to spread out over a decade or more. And so I think the things to be optimistic about are, since even January, I believe the size and the scope of the problem is now acknowledged by European policymakers. I don't think that was the case even 9 months ago. And there's a framework that's been established, and there's really just 3 or 4 levers for dealing with deleveragings. There is the transfer of wealth from the rich countries to the poor. We have that established with the ESM. There is austerity, which is now taking place across many of these countries, and is in some ways counterproductive, certainly in the near term, in terms of dealing with the deleveraging challenge. There are write-downs, both in the private sector as well as public sector write-downs, and there's monetization. And those first 3 are deflationary, and the monetization, of course, is inflationary, and the challenge for policymakers is getting that balance right, where they're balancing the deflationary and inflationary forces in a way that spreads the pain. It's going to be painful no matter what, over a long enough time frame that they can maintain some level of social and political cohesiveness. And so, good news, the framework has been established. The challenge is, of course, getting that right. And I don't want to take too much time here, but there's, I think, lots of reasons to believe that there's risk associated with getting that right, and I can go into that if you'd like.
We'll absolutely go into that. But I think you've laid out a terrific framework. Steve, do you agree that the Europeans recognize at least the scale of the challenge they face now?
I do. There's been an evolution of the views in Europe, really stemming from Germany. And the reason I answer your question, why I'm most concerned about Europe, is we've had a very hard problem, as you know, in the United States, trying to recognize that the deficit's a large problem here. We reacted very well in the United States to the banking crisis, and the banks are in very good shape right now due to that reaction. It's taken a much longer, and it's just starting to get on the consciousness, I think, today of the average American that the deficit's out of control here. Now, the good news about America is it's a federal system, and it's messy, but it has one centralized authority. The reason it's painful in Europe is if we've had such a problem here with the federal system, they have a state-by-state system, a country-by-country system, and they really have to do everything by cooperating, with different cultures and different objectives and a north-south divide that we don't really face in the United States. So you see how long it's taken us to really take the deficit seriously. It's obvious to me it would take a long time for the Europeans to kind of get there, number one. Number two, Germany has had an interesting evolution. I think by their nature, they don't believe in big deficit spending. They believe in more of the austerity approach and trying to keep things balanced. And I think their initial approach on this was to say, look, we've already seen all the issues with funding East Germany for many, many, many years beyond when they thought they'd have to fund it. And they didn't want to see that happening to Germany for the rest of Europe as well. I think they've stepped back and realized that they're all in the same box right now, that their economy has been to some extent propped up by the fact that they're the biggest exporter in Europe, and they export a lot of things to Greece, to Spain, to the other countries. And they've realized that they're kind of slitting their own throats if they go to a very radical approach which says everybody has to be self-sufficient, we're not going to fund the deficit. And if you step back with all these problems resulted over kind of a 10 or 15-year period. And to say we would fix it in a year or two is very unrealistic. To say we'd fix it with different governments and different objectives is very unrealistic. So my prediction is it's going to be a long, painful, slow process. Everyone's mindful of the fact that if you picked the direction of just disunity, that could be a disaster. At the same time, I don't think it's politically feasible to go to a federal system. You don't have the time, you don't have the energy. And so kind of the Three Bears story, the porridge is too cold, it's too hot. They've got to get it just right in the middle, where I believe that Germany and the countries that have been more fiscally responsible will get more control over the level of debts in the southern countries. They'll get more transparency. It'll be kind of a controlled situation.
No, you can't have our attention.
Fire Safety Director, please be advised that all testing of the life safety system has concluded for the day.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Fire Safety Director, I repeat, all testing of the building's life safety system has concluded for today.
Good. Thank you.
For your cooperation.
Thank you very much for telling us several times. Steve.
Well, at least I can tell my wife now they got a huge round of applause just for one answer in the middle of a panel. So what I was saying is I think that Germany has recognized they kind of have to go to the middle now and really settle for having more control.
Oh, for goodness sake.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? This is your building's fire safety director. Please be advised.
I feel like I'm on the Monty Python skit. Someone's going to come out.
Has been concluded for today. Once again, this is your building's fire safety director. All testing of the building's life safety system has concluded for this day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your cooperation.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, are you sure we're all set?
I think he finally has finished now. But
I think they saw the orange dress and the building was on. Thought the building was on
you're
fire.
blaming me now. Yeah, thanks. But let's take that before we get to the how do they get there. I mean, the phrase you hear constantly in Europe is we're building a bridge, and obviously the response to that is, are you building a bridge or are you building a pier that at some point you're kind of going to all fall off? But if you're building a bridge, you have to have a bridge to go somewhere. And do you have the sense, and I think you're absolutely right that there's some sort of middle ground that is not full federalism and is not a breakup, but describe to me what that looks like. Where are they actually going to?
Well, I would suspect where they're going to go to is the countries that are supplying the money are going to have increasing rights to have how much debt can be in a country, how far they'll go, how fast they'll go, and a monitoring system where they'll reward them for slowly getting the deficit down, and they'll punish them if they don't. So a more controlled system. And I think that's the only way you can go. All the countries that have gone to straight austerity almost in the history of time have suffered, huge depressions or very bad recessions. So I think it's kind of proven economic theory that if you decide that you're going to fix it in 1 year, it's going to be a very, very painful, 5 years after that. I think the conventional wisdom, which is correct, is that you need a path to glory. You need this bridge to glory, and it's got to be done in a controlled, thoughtful way. And I think the Germans, have come around to that. I think Draghi's done a good job. He really knows what he's doing, and he's done a good job, getting them to come along to that. So I think there's hope that they will do that. That's the good news. The bad news is that is not going to be a great scenario for huge economic growth in the next 5 years. And certainly for our business, we have to become much more microeconomists, where we look at a business that says, can this business gain share? Can it take advantage of a situation where there are high-cost competitors and do consolidations and grow the company through share? Because you're not going to have a tailwind in Europe at your back. You're just not going to have that tailwind.
Do you see echoes of Japan in this? I mean, not just in the political paralysis, but in actually the sort of an economic echo, in that you have rising debt to GDP ratios, which is the corollary of what you're saying. You have a banking system that increasingly doesn't really allocate capital properly, that is sort of stagnant. You have zombie banks, zombie companies. And the show is kept on the road, but it's kept on the road at the price of a continent which was already pretty stagnant, becoming even more stagnant.
No, I don't think that we're there yet. So in other words, I try to separate the conversation into two pieces. One is the response at the moment to the massive debt overhang, and then there's the whole conversation which Steve was tying into, which is connected politically, which is the overall governance, structural reform of the European Union. As I said, I think we're in the early days of dealing with the debt.
Are they separable?
Well, they're not separable, no. But well, they're separable in the following way. There is that combination of levers, the monetization, the transfer, the write-down, the austerity, is going to have to deal with the math. That combination of things, there's a math problem. There's not a market confidence problem, there's a math problem. And so the math problem has to be dealt with, and the balance of how that's dealt with will determine how that process plays out. It'll determine how different asset classes perform and so forth. If it's carried out well, there'll be some level of nominal growth maintained, inflation will be held in check, it'll spread out the pain, and you'll be able to hold this thing together politically over a decade.
What's the breakdown between transfers, austerity, write-downs, and monetization? What would you think would be the ideal breakdown, and what do you think will be the actual breakdown?
Well, the breakdown will be, the implementation of that will be where the deflationary forces by and large offset the inflationary forces in such a way that you're avoiding the Weimar Republic scenario where you have hyperinflation, and you're avoiding the Japan, or even worse, the Great Depression scenario before the second set of monetary stimulus in the latter part of the Great Depression. So getting that balance right is really critical, and it takes a degree of agility that I think, I'm hopeful will happen in Europe, but I think there's risk that it won't because of the governance structure. That's what Steve was referring to. You have the coalition governments, the parliaments, you have divergent economic interests between the core and the periphery, and the political circumstances, which are very challenging. So if you're Germany, you're trying to push in such a way that you're getting the balance much more in line with the austerity, not transfer, but write down sort of scenario, because that's politically viable and also potentially in your economic interest, but you're trying to push just hard enough to make that work at home within your coalition. If you're in Spain, you have a different set of interests in terms of that balance, and the challenge, think of a Venn diagram, is just threading that needle where you're able to maintain the level of support that's required in Germany and able to keep Spain intact when you have 50% unemployment.
That was going to be. I mean, you can design a sort of optimal economic strategy. Before we move on to the rest of the world, how much do you worry about the kind of the politics of the European street?
Well, that's the risk.
Well, yeah, I think what they're going to have to, I'd call it synthetic federalism. They're never going to get all the way to federalism in the situation, but they have enough rules where they can push it and try to find that balance. And the key will be finding that balance. And I think every time the Germans stare into the abyss, they are not going to like the choice of dissolution, gigantic write-downs, dislocations for their workers. I'm not as worried about deflation or inflation. I'm probably more worried about the Japan scenario. because the world really is a global market right now, and the fact that you have such cheap labor in Asia and other countries really is a damper, on inflation, and deflation. It's probably more of a risk of inflation these days.
And when you go to Europe and you find investment opportunities, do you see that dynamism there? Do you see that actually the sort of structural changes are happening at the micro level, which suggests that there is a way out beyond just dealing with the debt and the macro, that this is a continent that is changing and that can change?
We see business as very resilient. It's always been, it's resilient and changing. If you look at in fact, an incredible statistic, take it back to the United States, 55 years ago, the Fortune 500, there's only 15% of those companies left. In 55 years, 15% are the same today. So business has to be, resilient, and there's change happening all the time. And the corporations are normally, businesses are out ahead of the governments. So when we look at businesses, the ones that are reacting to this, they're reacting by, having products that work in each country, by diversifying their base, by finding export markets. And you've seen that in Germany. They've been immune to some of this because they've had such a great export-generated economy. I think we have to do that and learn from that, do that in the United States. I think the southern countries are going to have to now say, okay, the party's over. We're going to have a little more austerity and wean off the situations that's happened in the last 10 years. And hopefully, as David said, it'll just thread that needle. That's the best scenario for the world, best scenario for Europe.
Part of the reason that Germany has done so well is that it's found export markets in the emerging world, and it's done that spectacularly well, which I think is a kind of useful segue, because I've got my eyes on the clock, to look at the emerging world, where I think a big shift in this year has been, the bricks hitting a wall, if you will. The sort of substantial slowdown in the brick economies. Chinese economy is growing around 7% now. Lots of concern about whether it's a hard landing or not. Clearly perhaps the single biggest uncertainty, or one of the biggest uncertainties over the world economy. How do you think about that slowdown in the emerging world? Is it just cyclical, or is there some sort of secular slowdown too?
Well, I'm probably a little more optimistic on China than maybe your comment would suggest in the following way. So I think the next 10 years of China growth is going to be less aggressive than the last 10 years of China growth, in part because of the size and in part because of the structural reforms that have to take place in moving from an export-led economy to more domestic-driven demand, and then the fact that its export markets are slowing down radically. So the indebted developed world, if you believe what I described in terms of this isn't a 1 or 2 year thing, this is a spread out over a decade kind of thing, where the growth within the United States and Europe is going to be slower than it has been because it's no longer driven by credit to the degree it was, then the China outlook is going to be slower. But I think it's also the case that their ability to manage that is pretty good. And so if you would have gone back 3 years ago and said, how would the Chinese fare through this last 3 year period, I think they've demonstrated an ability to dial up and down their economy with the initial stimulus and with monetary policy and some of the administrative measures. I would have guessed, for example, that the administrative measures in the housing market would have been as effective as they have been. And they still have a lot of juice left in terms of the room they have on monetary and fiscal. And so if I add up the people who I think when I was in the Treasury and I would go to these international meetings, I think the people that are managing, the technocrats that are managing the Chinese economy are as able as anyone else in the world. Very capable, very capable. The demonstrated things that they've done over the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, they have a big, challenging economy, make no mistake. And then on top of that, the room that they have left, I think it's a soft landing. I think it's unlikely to be a hard landing, and I have some confidence they'll manage it well.
I'm sure you're right, but there is a sense in which, because they've handled the last few years well, there's a sort of general view out there that they know how to do this and they'll be fine. And I wonder whether, they have to make a very big transition towards a more domestically demand-focused economy. They had a huge stimulus, but it's caused quite a hangover that they're now having to deal with the consequences of. Do you share David's optimism about their ability to manage a soft landing or growth at 7-8%?
I don't know if I share the optimism over the short term, but the longer term, I think there's a huge tailwind behind China. China has created a middle class the size of all of America right now in the last 15 years, and they still have a long way to go. So basically, the Chinese have no choice. If they're going to have stability and harmony in that country, I think the people in power know that they've got to create jobs, they've got to move up the food chain, and they're doing that aggressively. Now, I don't know how well anybody can manage it over short-term blips, but long-term, there'll be a structural rise of China for the next 20 years. If you go back in the year 1,000 years ago, China and India were half the world GDP. 20 years ago, they were 10% of the world's GDP. In the next 20 years, they're trending towards 40 or 50%, in line with their populations as the incomes rise. So there's an enormous opportunity in China. And when you talk about Asia, I think we often make a mistake of lumping Asia all into one bucket. It's in the emerging markets into one bucket. They're very different markets. India doesn't have a lot of natural resources, but India has very little debt. They had a great banking system there. They didn't over-lever. You had none of the issues you had in Europe or the United States with the banking system. And they have a very educated population, and they're also creating a large middle class. Their issues are very different than China. China also doesn't have a lot of debt, but they've got to create these jobs for the people coming from the country. They've got to stop from going too fast and too slow. I do think you'll see a gap down in the growth rates, but we're talking about growth rates going from 11% or 12% down to 7 or 8%. And in a world where the United States and Europe are basically flat, that's a good growth rate.
Except that, no, that's right. But if you sort of look back over the last 10 years, you had kind of turbocharged growth in the emerging world before the crash and unsustainable credit-driven growth in the rich world. Then you had the Great Recession. Then you had a rapid bounce back in the emerging world, cushioning total weakness in the advanced world. If you're now in a world where the emerging economies are growing much slower than they were at the beginning of the last decade, then you have global growth that's pretty sluggish. It's kind of where we are now, really not that great. And doesn't that require some rethinking of the sort of premise that everybody had about rebalancing of global demand very dramatically to the emerging world? Or does it just mean that we have a rather kind of less rosy scenario than we thought even 2 years ago was possible?
It's all on a relative basis, and there are a lot of different factors in that. If you look at the United States, we've had a very large oil and gas boom here. So long term, as we switch to natural gas, which is here and abundant and cheap, and discover more oil here than we thought, that's going to be a positive. Right now, housing affordability is an all-time low right now in the United States. In fact, I think 350,000 units per year go out of service, and we're really not, in the last 6 years, we've not built to replace that. So we're going to see some pockets of strength. To me, the main issue here is if we get this deficit under control, not overnight, but a 6 or 7 year viable plan, as we talked about the same thing for Europe, then the United States will start to be an engine again and start to consume again. Everything will be a little lower relatively, but that doesn't mean a disaster scenario. And coming back to Japan, I don't think you can use the Japan analogy either for the US or for Europe, because Japan's a phenomenon of the fact that they self-fund everything there. Everything's artificially low because they own all their own debt. That's a big difference. In the United States, the Chinese own a lot of our debt. In Europe, Chinese and America owns a lot of European debt. So the foreign countries owning your debt is a forcing function, meaning you have to reform. Japan has been able to get away with that for a long period of time because they're essentially funding themselves.
You sound pretty upbeat about the US. Let's just have a quick conversation about that, which is, I don't know whether you heard the first conversation this afternoon about the fiscal cliff, but we may or may not go off the fiscal cliff, but there is this big shadow hanging over the US in the short term.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk too much about that, but do you think we will go off the fiscal cliff, and what would the impact be? And then more broadly, the sort of underlying strength or not of the US economy?
Let me go to the broad, and then I'll come to the fiscal, because I think the fiscal cliff is just one of the tail risks associated with the broader picture. But if I had a chart right now and showed you debt as a percentage of GDP, you would see that debt accumulation over the last 50 years, and you would have seen it hit a certain point in 2008, and then you would have seen it spiked. This is private and public sector debt. 2008 to 2009, 2010, it spiked, and now it's worked down, and you'd see that debt as a percentage of GDP is about where it was when the crisis started. Why do I tell you that? Because that's to reinforce that we're in the I'm sorry, but we're in the first or second inning of a long process over many years. Again, probably a decade. And now we've been
in that chart, you'll see that government debts actually continue to go up, but the consumers pay down their debt.
That's true. The consumers pay down their debt. That's true. But at a big picture level, what that implies is that growth in the U.S. economy is going to be, by and large, driven by income, not credit creation, not additional indebtedness in the short term. And so that's the challenge. The new growth outlook is going to be reflective of that dynamic. Is Roger
One
here?
second, Roger's here. Roger, I'm glad you made it.
We saved all the hard questions, Roger.
We've solved Europe, we've talked about China, we're on to the US now. So David, why don't you finish?
And we've had 2 fire drills as well
And yes, we've,
in the middle of the panel.
thank you so much. No problem.
Late.
David, why don't you just finish and then I'll turn
So
to Roger.
just by shorthand, so I think the implication of that is that even though I believe that those circumstances have been managed well, in other words, I think policymakers have by and large managed that deleveraging process well, that the reality is that you're going to have lower growth as a consequence of that dynamic, even though we see some short-term squiggles that are encouraging. And that growth outlook, I think, is somewhat fragile, and the risks that exist are largely to the downside. And so I think Europe is one significant risk. So what's that new world look like? 1.5%, 2% for the foreseeable future. Europe's one potential downside risk, and the fiscal cliff is another. And I think it's likely to have some bite in terms of a withdrawal of stimulus. It's essentially what it is. But nothing like the worst case scenario, 1.5%. I can tell you why that is, but that's
we might get to that in a minute, but I wanted to, and this is somewhat unfair of me, but Roger, I asked both of the other panelists which part of the world they were most worried about. And I wondered, I would start with that for you, which part of the world worries you most and why?
Short-term Europe, medium-term China. Short-term for obvious reasons. I think we're at halftime, so to speak, of that crisis. And medium-term, China has a very difficult conversion to make, as we all know, from an export-centered, investment-driven model to a domestic, more consumer-driven one, and it's a very tricky thing to do. I have a great deal of respect for the Chinese authorities. I think they're as keenly focused and aware of this as they possibly could be, but it's just a difficult transition.
What do you think the potential risks are in that transition? That there will be a sort of sudden hard landing, that they will that they will fail to make the transition somehow? What worries you?
I don't think a hard landing scenario is likely, but we all know that China has to grow at a rate that is unfamiliar on the high side to those in the West, and it has to do that to provide employment to the continued migration that's occurring within China. And so rates of growth which would be handsome, very, very handsome by Western standards, are not acceptable to China. So it's not a matter of just making the conversion. They have to make it and continue to grow above a rate of, let's say, 6% or 7%. That's an extremely high, difficult thing to do. So I think the risk is that they slow to a level that's below what they would see as the minimum, which gets into questions then of whether there'd be various forms of unrest.
So political risk alongside that. You didn't mention the US. Is that because you worry least about the US, or because you're really not worried about the US?
I think the short and medium-term outlook for the US is pretty reliable. Short-term meaning the next couple of years, we're going to still be grappling with the headwinds we're also familiar with, which mean we'll have, in most respects, subpar growth. I'm convinced we will grow, but we've been in the 2% zone. We might do slightly better next year, but not a lot. So it's painful growth, right along the lines of the Rogoff-Reinhardt thesis. And then once those headwinds die out, which I think will take 2 to 3 more years, I personally think the U.S. is more likely to surprise on the upside than anything else. We could get into that, but I think there'll be a housing boom. I think what's occurring in U.S. oil and gas production is breathtaking. We will continue to make some progress, not a renaissance, but some progress on manufacturing. I think we'll fix our deficit and debt problem to a sufficient degree. And I think the chances of the U.S. growing for 2 or 3 years at something like 4%, looking, again, 2 to 3 years from now, are really pretty good. So we all would like the United States to grow faster sooner. I don't think that's likely, but I don't think there's a lot of downside to that weakish short-term outlook.
I'd add to that there's also been a technological boom for a long period of time in the U.S., which is actually increasing as you get clusters of places like Silicon Valley in the Boston area, Research Triangle Park, and both the technology of medicine, software, hardware, the internet, which is going to really drive the world, is coming out of a large part of the U.S. And the U.S. has a large, I think, and sustainable lead, and we need to capitalize upon that lead. But that's another factor I think that's going to add besides oil and gas, besides the housing. I'm
going to turn to questions in just a second, but before I do that, two sort of broader questions. One is Mohammed Al-Erin, who was just giving a very interesting talk a few minutes ago, focused a lot, and he put up a slide where he had the brave central bankers pulling along the world economy, which was full of dithering and bickering politicians in a boat. Do you think central bankers, who've clearly acted far more boldly than anybody else pretty much across the rich world, history will look back and say, this was, thank goodness for them, if not, it would have all been disastrous? Or do you worry about where central bank policy is going, any of you?
Yes.
Yes on both.
So I think that I think that history will look back on them as really having responded in such a way that was both necessary and heroic, and that I believe the way that the 2008 till now would have played out would have been radically different and much, much worse had they not done what they have done. And I think it's historically consistent with what's happened, in past major deleveragings. I do think that it's opened a new era in terms of how central banks are perceived, and I think how the withdrawal is handled. And I worry particularly about the autonomy that the central bankers maintain within their political systems. I think that'll be touchy, and it'll have to be managed carefully. But I worry, for example, what will happen in our Congress. Post this election, depending on how that goes, I can imagine there being a set of hearings and a very, potentially risky conversation about the role of the central bank and the role of Congress and overseeing that and so forth. So I worry about that. I don't have any insight that that's likely to happen, but I think it's a risk.
We've had the banking political crisis all the way since the days of William Jennings Bryan burned them on a cross of gold in the United States. And I think the good news is that the bankers have reacted responsibly and brought us back from the brink. It's interesting that spanned two different political regimes in the United States, and both of them really went along the same policy. Yeah. They kept Geithner, and so you got to separate, as we know painfully at Bain Capital, you have to separate the hyperbole, the political hyperbole as to what you are versus what you really are. And I think the politicians were thoughtful when we came to a crisis, America's best in a crisis, they pulled together. They had basically the same policies to fix the crisis in a Republican and a Democratic Congress. And so they tend to be, in a crisis, they tend to listen to the people who are on the front line saying, here's the real data, here's what we have to do to avert a disaster, and they go with that. You have much more fighting when everything's going well than when we have problems. So I think they'll be looked back at kindly, and I think that the politicians have the hyperbole, but when they go in the back room, they sit down with Geithner and they sit down with Treasury. They understand, both sides understand what has to be done, and I hope they extend that to the deficit, because I'm more optimistic about the United States if a new administration, when whoever is elected next time sits down and they say, we are going to solve the deficit problem, we're not going to go off the cliff, we're going to move towards something, some variant of Simpson Bowles, that will start new thinking about investment, new thinking about demand, and get us back on track. And so it might not be 3 years if they can really do that. We'll see.
How much, Roger, has to be done on the deficit and a medium-term deficit plan to end that sense of uncertainty and to get exactly the outcome that Steve is talking about? What's needed?
I think that if there is a reasonable long-term agreement, either in the lame duck session or more likely early in 2013, it isn't likely to be a perfect one. A lot of folks in the business and financial communities will say it's too small. Others will say it's not quite balanced enough. But I think it will. I think that there probably will be one which will boost confidence and dispel a lot of the clouds. I'm actually an optimist on whether there will or won't be a reasonable agreement. I think there will be.
What do you think the broad contours of it would include?
I think the most likely, I'll tell you what I think the most likely scenario is, but I want to preface it by saying that this is an extremely fluid situation. We all saw just 2 nights ago the president made a very striking comment about the sequester. And it's an obvious prelude to the sequester being put aside. I don't think there's any doubt about that now. So it's very fluid. And there are a lot of different scenarios. My 2 cents is the most likely scenario is that the administration makes a proposal, a more aggressive proposal on further reductions in mandatory spending or entitlements. And ultimately, there is an agreement on returning to the Clinton-era rates in terms of income taxes. Ideally, we would see tax reform along the lines of Simpson-Bowles, but it's important to remember that's profound tax reform. If you look at their proposed treatment, and I happen to really like it, on deductions, and we all know some of the most important ones, mortgage interest, charitable, state and local tax payments, and so forth. Historically, it's taken many years to achieve reform that's sweeping. Last time we did it was '86. The legislation which ultimately turned into the '86 Tax Reform Act was introduced in '82. Some of the world's most skilled legislators, Jim Baker and so forth, were involved in that. That took 4 years, and that was 25 years ago. The idea that in 2 or 3 months in 2013 we would achieve the type of tax reform that's inherent in Simpson-Bowles I don't think is realistic. And since we needed an agreement in that time frame, I think the most likely agreement is not a tax reform-centered agreement, but rather an agreement where the administration proposes more on the mandatory side. Ultimately, there's an agreement to return to the Clinton-era tax rates. I don't think that's going to be easy to achieve. It may be, maybe a tumultuous scenario, but that's the most likely agreement, and that would be seen as a roughly $3.5 trillion 10-year agreement because there's already about 2.2 in the pipeline between drawdown of war costs and the Budget Control Act of 2011 and the savings that are flowing from that. Again, a lot of people would say it's too small, other people would say it's unbalanced, but I think that would dispel a lot of the clouds and boost confidence.
Interesting. I will ask the 2 of you to comment on that too, but let's open for questions. Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. I just want to push an issue that also came up in Mohammed's comment for the panel to respond. There's a view evolving within Thoughtful Circle about a disjuncture between our economic systems and our political systems. The economic system moving increasingly in a globalized interdependent context, whereas the political systems, particularly Western democracies, increasingly localized, and part of it has to do with the capacity of the political leadership that these systems is creating, and the leadership's function seems to be more tactical than strategic. And that's sort of at the heart of how, over a duration, we're going to address some of the fundamental issues. You know, the dogma today seems to be China has to move more towards consumption in terms of the global rebalancing, but not enough question going into if it did do that and rebalanced its economy, then how tactically or strategically, what does it mean for the United States to engage with a China that is less dependent on the United States or Western Europe buying from it? I'd be interested in your observation on this deficiency of leadership emanating from our political systems in its capacity to address the fundamental economic problems we are dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you. So a very broad question about political leadership, and then a sort of specific iteration of it in terms of the relationship between China and the US, which I think is a very interesting question. Where does, if China's economy shifts, what does that do to the relationship? Roger?
I appreciate why Mohammed may have said that, and I hear that one hears a lot, reads a lot about that. At the same time, there are a lot of people who think we've had a deficit of leadership since the passing of Plato. I'm not a subscriber to that theory. I think if one studies carefully history, and let's just take American history for a moment, what people think of as leadership or quality of leadership just comes and goes in cycles. And we've had moments of weak leadership, inward leadership, tactical leadership, whatever your phrase is, many times through American history. We'll have it many times again. We're not at a particular low point on that scale, nowhere near one. I don't think we are either globally. Maybe the pressures for improved leadership or better leadership are greater because of globalization, sure. But are we at some sort of historical low on the leadership quotient? No.
What about China, David? The changing, and if I might just paraphrase your question, but how a changing Chinese economy changes the dynamic with the US?
Well, I think, to tie it to what Roger's saying, I think that I agree with the point about the leadership, but I do think that you see through history the ebbs and the flows of political conflict and xenophobia tied to decline in economic well-being. And so I think leadership within a period like this is explicitly to look outward when the bias will be because of the pain that they're experiencing in Greece or Spain or the United States, to blame and to polarize internationally, in part because you're looking for a scapegoat. I think I think that pattern is evident through time, and I think within the case of China, I think that's a little mini case of unfortunate politicization of that relationship within the political context. It's not. I think it's on both sides of the aisle within the United States, which I think is counterproductive. I think in the overall scheme of things, the Chinese and the United States the leadership both recognizes that and manages through it. But I think that it's, that creates risk. I think you see that in some of the currency discussions and so forth. And so I worry about it, but I don't think it's, I think it's a squiggle within the overall scheme of things. And I think there's a commitment on both sides to make that transition to domestic demand. And I think that there's a meeting of the minds in the United States, both parties, and within China.
Steve?
The political system for years, I agree with Roger, has had leadership and not leadership, but it's often correlated with the strength of the crisis. Politicians aren't paid to take big risks in times where there's not a perceived crisis or a real reason to do something. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was a crisis, and we solved that crisis. They solved the Depression with the radical moves that they made during the Depression, expansionary theory. And so the question will be, when will we get to a point where Europe is going badly, there's slower growth in China, where we recognize and say, we've got to get our own house in order. And I'm optimistic that we're getting there right now. Business is stepping up, and lots of meetings about how do we help the government, get the deficit down? How do we lobby to figure out a path, a 7 or 8 year path to get the deficit down? That there wasn't talk about that 5 years ago. There is talk about that today. People are talking about the fact that it's more polarized than ever. It's always been polarized, but people are talking about that now and saying we really want to elect some people that come to the middle, and the politicians will get that message. So the sooner we recognize that going from 16 trillion national debt, by the way, we only crossed $1 trillion in 1982, believe it or not, and now it's $1 trillion per year, but going from 16 to 20 is a really bad thing over the next 4 years, and we've got to do the things that Roger talked about, come to the middle, get that solved, not immediately, but on an 8 year path. The politicians hopefully will recognize that, and I think you're seeing some grassroots movement where people are saying, gee, we just can't keep going down this path ananymore.
Well, that's some optimism. Another question. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. Yes, gentleman there.
Steve Johnson from Reuters. Just a question. Do you worry at all about dwindling support for free trade and the seeming incidents of increasing protectionist sentiment? And I mean, whether you're talking about the myriad U.S.-China disputes or Canada blocking Malaysian, investment in its energy sector, or Brazil raising tariffs and talking about currency wars. I mean, given the fact that global growth is fairly sluggish to begin with, I mean, if this continues, is this a big concern? Is this a big threat to the global economy?
David?
I think that I think it is a threat in the sense that in these circumstances that often happens. The point I was making earlier. I think if you look back, from 2008 until now, across administrations, I think that the number of actions on the U.S. side and even globally have been relatively modest when you put it in historical perspective. And so I think there's a vigilance that's required, and I think it's a risk, but I think it's not, I don't think the data would support any major trend that should set off real alarm bells. It's just something we need to be worried about.
Global trade has moved from it is 80 trillion GDP in the world. It's moved from 30 years ago, 5% to over 50% now. So I don't think there's any turning back, and I think most governments and politicians recognize that a massive reduction of global trade will be a real problem for each of their own countries. So I think there's a governor on that.
One more question, if there is. No more questions? Yes, one more question there.
Is there a bright side to the fiscal cliff?
Well, it sounds like Roger.
Are there any advantages to going off? You mentioned that it wouldn't be as bad as people were saying it's going to be.
Is this directed towards me?
Yeah.
I think I said that. Well, I think the good news is I'm with Roger. I think something's going to happen. I think there's an enormous amount of focus. I think the risks associated with the cliff have brought, the thing that's hard to get, which is an enormous amount of focus on it. I think that when I go off the cliff, I don't think there's likely to be an agreement in the lame duck in any meaningful way, and so I think that there'll be a little blip off the cliff with payroll taxes and everything else. But I do think there'll be a deal in the new year, and I think ultimately that deal is going to be a substantively better deal, regardless of how the outcomes of the election, than it would have been without the focus that comes from the CEOs across the country and everybody else saying this is a major issue. So
it's really using the threat of the cliff to get at solutions.
Right.
It's great. It's really.
Do you agree with that? That it sounds like you're saying we go off the cliff temporarily.
Well, I don't think we're going. I think they're going to extend.
Well, no, but when I say off the cliff, I think that I think the chances of the bite from middle-class tax cuts and the sequestration and all of that happening in the way that if you lay out the scenarios, the worst-case scenario, is highly unlikely. I do think that there's likely to be a blip in terms of fiscal withdrawal in the form of the payroll tax and some other things. So I think the totality of what happens in the new year is going to be negative to growth, but I think modestly negative compared to a real down step, which is what some people were predicting might happen.
But there is going to be, it sounds like you all agree, strong odds of a substantial fiscal agreement next year. Am I right? That all three of you think that that's...
I think there has to be. I think we're at a point where there has to be. Governments can extend things a long time, though, so I wouldn't say it's 100% certainty. If it isn't, they'll extend the fiscal cliff and do what we're doing right now for another year, and then they'll have to do it at the end of the next year. But I can't imagine it, lasting longer than a year.
And
I have a little different view. I think if there's a meaningful extension, I guess I'd define that as more than 3 months or 4 months, the opportunity to achieve a good long-term agreement may be missed. So I don't think there's going to be what I would call a serious extension. I don't know, about a month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And I do think the odds on an agreement, although I think the road from here to there is very difficult, and it's not going to be simple or clear or necessarily pretty, I think the chances of an agreement are pretty good.
well, on that, I think relatively optimistic note, in fact, probably absolutely optimistic note, I think we have to end the panel. We've run out of time. Thank you all three very much.
I'm sorry I was late.
No problem.